Hey guys, this is David Payton from New York. Welcome to Boring History Documentary. Tonight, we are stepping into one of the least glamorous corners of the medieval world, and also one of the most revealing. Because a toilet is never just a toilet. It tells us how people lived, how cities were built, what they feared, what they tolerated, and what they simply had no choice but to endure. Medieval toilets were certainly unpleasant by modern standards, but the deeper story is more interesting than a list of bad smells and filthy habits. What made them so disgusting was not just dirt. It was architecture, climate, crowding, limited plumbing, inherited Roman knowledge that had partly faded, and a daily closeness to waste that most modern people rarely have to imagine. And once we look closely, the subject becomes less ridiculous and much more human. Before we get into it, if you enjoy calm, thoughtful long-form history like this, consider subscribing. This channel is for people who like slow, carefully told stories that make the past feel real without turning it into noise. And if you'd like to support that kind of history on YouTube, a simple like on the video really does help. As always, feel free to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and which history topic you'd like us to explore in a future documentary. The easiest mistake to make with medieval sanitation is to imagine that people simply did not care about cleanliness. That is too simple and it misses the point. Medieval people often cared very much about foul smells, stagnant water, and unhealthy air. Many believed that bad odors themselves could spread illness. They washed when they could, they valued fresh water, and they understood in practical terms that filth made life worse. But caring about hygiene is not the same as having the means to enforce it. A peasant in a timber cottage, a monk in a monastery, a merchant in a growing town, and a noble in a stone castle all face the same basic fact. Every human body produces waste every single day, and removing it safely requires labor, planning, engineering, and space. Those four things were often in short supply. To understand why medieval toilets could be so revolting, it helps to begin with the house itself. Many homes in medieval Europe were small, dark, smoky, and crowded. In rural areas, people often lived close to animals, close to cooking fires, and close to stored food. In towns, they lived close to neighbors, workshops, alleys, refuse pits, and open drains. Privacy was limited. Ventilation was uneven. Flooring might be packed earth, wood planks, or rough stone. Water had to be fetched, carried, and used carefully. In that environment, there was no neat modern division between clean domestic space and separate sanitary infrastructure. Waste was not magically flushed away. It remained a problem that had to be managed physically, and often imperfectly by hand. For the poorest people, the answer could be brutally simple. A bucket, a chamber pot, a pit, or a corner away from the main living space might serve the purpose. That does not mean everyone was relieving themselves carelessly in the same room where they ate, but the boundaries were far looser than modern audiences are used to. Chamber pots were common because they were practical. A person could use one during the night, especially in cold weather, and empty it later. Yet that convenience came with obvious consequences. The pot had to be stored somewhere before it was emptied. Could spill, could crack, could be neglected, and in a crowded household, multiple people might be relying on a very small number of such containers. Even if someone intended to keep the home orderly, odor and contamination were never far away. The next step up was the privy pit, which sounds straightforward until you picture what it meant over time. A privy was often little more than a seat or structure placed above a hole in the ground. In theory, this allowed waste to collect out of sight. In practice, the pit filled. Its contents seeped. Heavy rain could complicate everything. Ground conditions mattered. Soil, drainage, and proximity to wells could make a bad arrangement worse. Once a pit became too full, someone had to deal with it. That might mean covering it and digging another, or emptying it in some fashion. Neither option was pleasant. In densely settled places, where room was limited, there was no endless supply of fresh ground to use and abandon. And this is where the medieval toilet stops being merely a private matter and becomes an urban one. Towns were the real test. Population density created pressure. More people meant more waste, not only human waste but animal dung, industrial runoff, spoiled food, and household rubbish. Streets could be narrow, drainage poor, and local authority inconsistent. Some towns had rules about where refuse could be dumped and when waste could be removed, which already tells you that the problem was serious enough to require regulation. But passing a rule and enforcing it were different things. Even when officials tried, habit, poverty, weather, and sheer volume often defeated good intentions. A medieval town could therefore contain a whole layered ecology of unpleasantness. Chamber pots emptied into gutters. Waste from privies seeped into nearby ground. Rain washed filth into streets and low areas. Animals added their own contribution. Tanners, butchers, dyers, and other trades could create especially offensive byproducts. The smell was not occasional. It was part of the environment. And this is one reason the topic is more revealing than it first appears. Medieval toilets were disgusting not because they failed in isolation, but because they existed inside a wider system that was already overloaded. The privy was only one node in a much larger problem. Castles, of course, present a more famous image. Here modern viewers often picture grand halls, banners, armor, and flickering torchlight. But castles also had latrines, and those latrines could be dreadful. In many stone fortifications, the classic arrangement was a garderobe, essentially a toilet chute built into the wall so waste could fall downward into a pit, a lower chamber, or in some cases beyond the outer wall. On paper, this seems clever. Gravity did the work. The user remained inside the castle. No one needed elaborate pipes. Yet the reality could be miserable. The shaft could trap smells. Wind could blow foul air back upward. If the drop area was not properly cleaned, accumulation became a serious problem. In a siege, conditions grew worse. Water was limited, cleaning was difficult, and the garrison could not simply abandon the structure and start again somewhere else. The garderobe also reminds us that medieval sanitation was deeply shaped by architecture. A toilet was not just an object but a built relationship between height, stone, airflow, drainage, and labor. If a castle wall latrine was positioned badly, or if the receiving pit was neglected, the entire arrangement could become unbearable. In winter, the cold might be severe. In summer, the smell might intensify. In wet conditions, runoff could spread contamination. And because castles were symbols of power, there is a useful irony here. Even nobles and officials living behind thick walls and under painted ceilings could not escape the basic biological reality that their residents needed somewhere for waste to go. Wealth could improve privacy and construction, but it did not eliminate stench. Monasteries and larger religious houses sometimes handled sanitation more effectively. And this is where the story becomes more nuanced. Some monastic communities had comparatively sophisticated latrine blocks, often built with communal seating over running water or drainage channels. This can sound surprisingly advanced, and in some cases it was. Monasteries were disciplined institutions. They had routines, labor systems, and a strong interest in order. They could plan collectively in ways that scattered households could not. But even here, improvement had limits. Running water was not always plentiful or reliable. Maintenance mattered constantly. Stone channels could clog. Wooden fittings decayed. Smells lingered. And communal latrines solved one problem while creating another familiar medieval truth. Privacy was a luxury, and bodily functions remained more socially exposed than many people today would tolerate. That point is worth pausing on because it subtly changes how we imagine medieval life. One reason the medieval toilet seems especially disgusting to modern audiences is not just the smell or the mess, but the collapse of privacy. We are used to small, sealed, personal spaces for washing and relief. Medieval people often were not. Shared sleeping spaces, shared workspaces, shared beds in some contexts, and shared facilities all produced a different threshold of embarrassment. That does not mean they felt no shame. It means social life was organized differently. Bodily realities were more visible. The line between private discomfort and ordinary routine was thinner. And once you understand that, the toilet becomes a clue to the emotional texture of the period as much as to its sanitation. There was also the question of what people used after relieving themselves, which is rarely glamorous and often handled vaguely in modern retellings. The answer varied with region, wealth, and circumstance. Straw, hay, moss, leaves, scraps of cloth, wool, and other materials might be used depending on what was available. Water could also play a role in some places and traditions, but none of these options offered the neat consistency modern consumers expect. Materials could be rough, damp, reused in undesirable ways, or simply inadequate. Comfort was not guaranteed. Cleanliness was relative. And once again, the problem leads back to resources. Good sanitation depends not only on toilets but on supply chains of water, cloth, soap, and regular disposal. Medieval life often lacked the abundance required to make these systems convenient. The labor behind all of this is another hidden layer. Waste did not disappear on its own. In larger settlements, there were people whose job involved removing it, cleaning pits, clearing drains, and doing work most others preferred not to think about. This was difficult, dirty, and socially low-status labor, but it was essential. A town could not function without people handling what everyone else produced. And this is one of the quiet historical twists running through the subject. The medieval toilet was disgusting partly because it exposed a truth that prosperous societies often conceal. Sanitation depends on invisible workers. When those workers are underpaid, overwhelmed, or absent, the system fails very quickly. Medieval towns understood that at the level of daily experience. Even the seasons could change the character of filth. In hot weather, odors intensified and insects multiplied. In cold weather, waste might freeze, linger, or become more difficult to move. Rain could wash some areas clean while making others far worse, carrying contamination into wells, cellars, and streets. Drought reduced available water for cleaning. Flooding created disasters of mixture, where latrines, drains, refuse pits, and natural water sources stopped being separate. Medieval sanitation was therefore always tied to the environment. A toilet was never just a seat over a pit. It was part of a fragile balance between people, animals, weather, and the built world. And that balance could break in ways that made ordinary life exhausting long before it became dramatic. The real misery was often cumulative. It was waking to stale air in a cramped room. It was walking past the gutter in summer. It was emptying a pot in the dark. It was sharing a privy used by dozens of others. It was the routine knowledge that cleanliness took effort, that smells returned quickly, and that waste was always closer than comfort. Medieval people adapted because they had to, but adaptation is not the same thing as ease. In the next part of the story, that everyday burden begins to connect with disease, urban rules, household habits, and the surprising ways some communities tried, and often failed, to make filthy necessities slightly more bearable. That effort and that failure can be seen most clearly when we look at the rules medieval communities wrote for themselves. The existence of sanitation laws tells us something important at once. People knew the problem was real. Town councils, manor courts, and local authorities did not issue repeated warnings about dumping waste into streets or waterways because no one minded. They did it because bad sanitation disrupted trade, offended neighbors, threatened water supplies, and made already crowded settlements harder to live in. In other words, medieval people were not blind to filth. They were trapped in a long and uneven struggle against it, using limited tools and imperfect enforcement. A growing town needed some rough agreement about where waste could go. If every household simply threw slops, dung, ash, and chamber pot contents into the nearest open space, the settlement would become impassable. So rules appeared. Some places limited dumping near markets. Some forbade blocking drains. Some required householders to keep the area in front of their property reasonably clear. Others tried to regulate butchers, fishmongers, or tanners, whose work created especially intense smells and contamination. Yet the persistent reappearance of these rules suggests the obvious. They were often ignored. A fine on paper did not guarantee a clean alley. If someone was poor, busy, sick, or indifferent, the easiest option was still the nearest gutter, lane, or pit. This is one of the quieter but more revealing aspects of medieval toilets and sanitation. The problem was not merely technological. It was social. Even where practical improvements were possible, they depended on collective behavior. A single household could keep its own chamber pots emptied regularly, its privy reasonably maintained, and its floor swept. But if the neighbor emptied waste into a shared passage, if the street drain clogged, if animals wandered through refuse, or if the local watercourse was polluted upstream, private effort could only achieve so much. Medieval sanitation was therefore always unstable. It was shaped by the weakest point in the chain, and in crowded places that weak point was never hard to find. Water, unsurprisingly, sat at the center of that chain. The medieval toilet became especially disgusting when it existed too close to the water people drank. Wells, cisterns, streams, and rivers were precious. They supplied households, workshops, cooking, brewing, washing, and animals. Yet the same settlement that relied on water also had to dispose of waste somewhere. In theory, a community could separate these functions. In practice, distance, terrain, and convenience often worked against that ideal. A privy pit dug too near a well could become dangerous over time. A ditch used for drainage might carry foul material toward a stream. A river passing through a town could serve as both water source and waste channel, depending on where one stood along it. That contradiction is one of the reasons medieval sanitation often feels so shocking to modern viewers. We are accustomed to systems designed to keep clean water and waste apart through pipes, treatment plants, pumps, sealed drains, and regular inspection. Medieval people often lived in a world where such separation was partial, local, and vulnerable. The stream that seemed fresh above the town might not be fresh below it. The well that looked safe could be affected by what had been buried or spilled nearby. People did not need microscopes to notice some of these risks. They could see discoloration, smell foulness, and observe that some places seemed unhealthy. But understanding that contamination was possible did not mean they could always prevent it. And this is where the story becomes more layered than the old stereotype of a dirty age blindly wallowing in filth. Medieval people often associated foul smells with danger, and although their medical explanations were not modern, that instinct was not entirely foolish. A stinking ditch really was a bad sign. Rotting matter really did attract vermin and insects. Contaminated water really did cause illness, even if the mechanism was not understood in modern terms. So when people complained about stenches, when authorities tried to move waste away from certain areas, or when religious houses invested in latrine channels and drainage, they were responding to something practical. The tragedy was that practical awareness alone could not solve a systemic problem. Household habits mattered as much as public rules. Consider the chamber pot again, that ordinary object that quietly tied private life to public sanitation. Its use was easy enough. Its disposal was the difficulty. In a well-ordered routine, Someone would carry it out in the morning and empty it into a designated place. But mornings are not always orderly. Children are restless. Workers rise before dawn. Weather is poor. The lane is muddy. Person is old or ill. A servant is overworked. Under those conditions, convenience wins. Waste gets emptied somewhere close or later than it should, or in a place that seems temporarily acceptable. Multiplied across an entire street, these tiny compromises produced the smellscape of medieval urban life. The night made everything worse. Darkness reduced care. Lighting was weak. Uneven floors, stairs, and courtyards made late movement hazardous. In a townhouse with several stories, climbing down to a yard privy after midnight might be cold, difficult, and unsafe. In a castle or manor, the more formal toilet space might still be inconvenient in bad weather. In a village home, leaving the warmth of the household at night could be deeply unpleasant. So chamber pots remained essential. They spared people one difficulty while storing up another. By morning, rooms could hold several used vessels, especially in larger households. Before any fresh air or daylight improved conditions, the smell was already there. Beds and sleeping arrangements add another uncomfortable layer. Medieval households often had more shared sleeping than modern viewers imagine. Family members, servants, apprentices, guests, and children could sleep in close proximity. In poorer homes, sleeping space was simply whatever could be managed. That meant the bodily consequences of the night were more communal too. The presence of chamber pots near beds, the risk of spills, the mixing of stale air with smoke from the hearth, and the limited privacy of dressing and washing all made sanitation part of the emotional atmosphere of home. It was not always dramatic. More often it was simply wearying, a background condition of life that people accepted because there was no obvious alternative. What makes this especially interesting is that medieval people did, at times, try to improve the sensory experience even when they could not fully improve the infrastructure. Herbs, rushes, flowers, incense, and perfumes might be used to soften odors in living spaces. Floors could be strewn with fresh plant material. Hands might be rinsed with scented water on formal occasions. Privies themselves could not be transformed into pleasant spaces in any modern sense, but the wider household could at least attempt to push back against the smell of daily life. This was not vanity. It was environmental management in a world where foul air was both offensive and, to many minds, unhealthy. The effort tells us again that people were not indifferent. They were negotiating with unpleasant necessity. Still, there were limits to how much scent could hide. One of the strongest curiosities in the medieval toilet story is that rank and status changed the form of discomfort more than they removed it. A noble household might have a dedicated garderobe with stone construction and better separation from food preparation and sleeping areas. A monastery might have organized latrines over a drainage channel. A prosperous townhouse might include a backyard privy and servants to clean it. These arrangements mattered. They could reduce inconvenience, improve privacy, and slightly control contamination. But even the best medieval facilities rarely offered what a modern viewer would call sanitary confidence. Smell, seepage, insects, and periodic accumulation remained stubborn realities. Castles provide an especially useful example of this because they combined military design with domestic needs. A defensive structure was built first to hold, protect, and intimidate. Comfort was secondary, and sanitation had to fit within that logic. A latrine set into a wall chute was efficient in one sense but unforgiving in another. If wind direction shifted, if the shaft fouled, if the drop point below became clogged, or if the castle was occupied by many more people than usual, the arrangement could become oppressive. During military tensions, the situation was worse. A castle preparing for siege might bring in extra provisions, extra animals, and extra people. All of them increased the sanitary burden. Suddenly, the toilet was no longer a private fixture. It became part of the problem of survival. Sieges sharpened every weakness of medieval sanitation. Water might need to be rationed. Cleaning became less frequent. Crowding increased. Fear changed behavior. Waste disposal points could become dangerous if exposed to enemy observation or attack. If a garrison had to remain within walls for a long period, odors intensified, pits filled, and the distinction between ordinary discomfort and genuine health risk narrowed. This is one reason fortress latrines, so often treated as quaint architectural details, deserve more serious attention. They reveal the hidden domestic cost of warfare. Armies are remembered for banners, horses, and walls breached at dawn. But the people inside those walls also had to eat, sleep, fall ill, and use the toilet under increasingly miserable conditions. Monasteries, again, offer a useful contrast, not because they were clean in a modern sense, but because they demonstrate what discipline could achieve. In some religious communities, the latrine block was deliberately placed so that flowing water could carry waste away. The structure might be shared, linear, and built with repeated seating. Such arrangements could be more effective than scattered household privies because they concentrated maintenance and aligned it with routine. Monks followed schedules. Labor could be assigned. Rules could be reinforced. Yet even this relative success depended on geography and constant upkeep. Flowing water could slow. Channels could silt up. Stone could crack. Winter could interfere. And communal use introduced its own discomforts, especially in terms of noise, smell, and the very medieval absence of privacy. The psychological side of that shared experience is easy to underestimate. Modern people usually think of the toilet as one of the last strongly defended zones of personal seclusion. Medieval life often did not provide that expectation. Even in ordered environments, bodily functions were more exposed to collective rhythms. There is a tendency to assume that this made people less sensitive, but that too is too simple. It may be more accurate to say that shame and tolerance were arranged differently. One could feel embarrassment and still have no practical way to secure solitude. One could dislike the smell and still have to sit in a shared block. One could value cleanliness and still live in a world where tools for cleanliness were limited. These contradictions were normal. Another overlooked detail is the role of clothing. Medieval garments were often layered, tied, belted, pinned, or laced in ways that made some toilet arrangements awkward. This mattered more than one might think. A toilet that is inconvenient to use tends to be dirtier, slower, and more frustrating. In cold weather, extra layers complicated things. For women, long garments and the demands of privacy created additional difficulty, especially in public or semi-public spaces. For the elderly, the sick, or pregnant women, access was even more challenging. A badly placed privy was not just unpleasant. It could be genuinely hard to use safely and quickly. That meant accidents, spills, and hurried improvisation, all of which added to the general burden of sanitation. Children, too, shaped the sanitary environment of the medieval household. A home with many young children produced more mess, more washing, and more urgent needs. Formal privies were not always suitable for them. Chamber pots, corners of yards, and other makeshift solutions would naturally be used. Each of these demanded adult labor afterward. In a modern home with running water, soap, sealed flooring, and regular laundry, the mess of childhood is manageable in one way. In a medieval setting, every extra cleaning task required hauling water, scrubbing surfaces that absorbed odors, airing cloth slowly, and finding places to dispose of what could not be kept indoors. The toilet story therefore overlaps with the history of parenting, domestic labor, and the sheer exhaustion of maintaining order. And then there were animals which were never far away. Horses, pigs, chickens, goats, dogs, and other creatures moved through medieval settlements in ways unfamiliar to many modern urban dwellers. Their presence added warmth, food, transport, and income, but also dung, noise, and disease risk. In some towns, pigs famously roamed streets, rooting through refuse and in effect participating in waste disposal, though not in a sanitary way one would want to praise. This created a strange, almost circular system. Human settlements produced waste. Animals fed on or moved through parts of that waste. Their own droppings then intensified the contamination of streets and yards. The medieval privy was disgusting, yes, but it was disgusting inside a wider ecology that was constantly being stirred, trampled, and redistributed by animals. Once you see that ecology, even small design choices start to matter more. The position of a yard privy relative to a kitchen door, the depth of a pit, the slope of a lane, the placement of a drain, the distance to the well, the presence of paving, the frequency of cart traffic, the availability of labor to empty cesspits, even the direction of prevailing wind, all of these could change daily experience. A town did not need a spectacular sanitary collapse to be unhealthy. It only needed enough minor inefficiencies operating at once. And because medieval building was incremental, not centrally planned in the modern sense, those inefficiencies accumulated. Houses leaned into lanes. Extensions were added. Drains were improvised. New neighbors dug pits where older residents had once had open space. Over time, the built environment itself trapped and magnified filth. That helps explain why cesspit emptying became such necessary and hated work. A pit could serve for a while, especially in a small household, but eventually it filled. Then came the grim task of removal. Workers had to dig, shovel, haul, and transport material that had been fermenting below ground, sometimes for months or years. The smell would have been overwhelming. The texture, the risk of splashing, the confined space, and the foul gases all made the job miserable and dangerous. Yet from a historian's point of view, the existence of such labor is strangely encouraging. It means towns did not simply surrender. However inadequate the system was, people still organized effort to keep it from becoming even worse. The disgusting toilet was part of an ongoing cycle of neglect, intervention, and relapse. And relapse was common because growth outpaced control. As towns became busier, wealthier, and more commercially connected, they did not automatically become cleaner. In some respects, they became harder to manage. More visitors meant more waste. More specialized trades meant more polluted runoff. More rented lodgings meant more crowded courtyards and more pressure on shared facilities. Prosperity could finance better stone buildings, guild halls, markets, and churches, but it could also intensify the problem of where all the byproducts of urban life should go. Medieval sanitation was therefore caught in a paradox. Success created new forms of strain. A thriving town was often a dirty town, and the very energy that made it important also made it smell worse. By this point, a deeper pattern begins to emerge. The medieval toilet was disgusting not because people lacked intelligence, and not merely because they had primitive equipment, but because sanitation is one of the most demanding achievements of civilization. It requires engineering, habit, administration, water control, labor, and social cooperation all working at once, every day with almost no interruption. Medieval Europe could manage parts of that puzzle in places and at times. What it struggled to sustain was the whole system, and that struggle becomes even more striking when we turn from the privy itself to the broader question medieval people feared most. What happened when foul environments, bad water, crowded towns, and fragile bodies met the constant threat of illness? That constant threat of illness gave medieval sanitation a moral and emotional weight that is easy to miss if we only treat toilets as a source of dark amusement. People did not merely dislike filth because it offended the senses. They lived in a world where sickness could arrive suddenly, where children were vulnerable, where fever could spread through a household, and where explanations for disease were partial, contested, and often bound up with air, balance, diet, season, and divine judgment. In that setting, the foul privy, the stagnant ditch, and the polluted stream became more than unpleasant features of the landscape. They became part of a larger anxiety about what kind of environment a human body could survive. Medieval medicine did not understand germs in the modern sense, but it would be a mistake to assume that this left people with no practical instincts at all. Many believed that corrupted air, especially air carrying the odor of rot, decay, or stagnant moisture, could damage health. That framework, often described later as concern with miasma or bad air, did not identify the microscopic mechanism behind infection. Yet it still directed attention toward many of the places that really were dangerous. Overflowing pits, rotting refuse, blocked drains, marshy low ground, and foul indoor spaces. In other words, medieval people could be wrong about why a place was unhealthy and still be correct that it was. This is one of the most useful reversals in the whole story. Their theory was incomplete, but their observations were often sharper than modern stereotypes allow. That helps explain why urban authorities sometimes cared so much about smells. To a modern ear, an order to remove dung, clear a drain, or stop dumping waste in a lane may sound like a simple plea for civic tidiness. But for medieval communities, odor could signal corruption in a far deeper sense. A stinking place was not just offensive. It was a warning that the natural order of the town had broken down. Filth was evidence that things were not flowing, not circulating, not being removed in the proper sequence. Waste was staying where it should not stay. Water was carrying what it should not carry. Air was holding what it should not hold. The toilet, then, sits inside a wider medieval fear of stagnation. And few things stagnated more ominously than a badly maintained cesspit. When a privy pit or urban cesspit sat too long without proper emptying, it became a concealed reservoir of danger, at least as contemporaries perceived it and, in many practical cases, as it actually was. Liquids seeped into surrounding soil. Foul vapors rose. Insects gathered. If the pit was near domestic space, people lived with its presence every day even when it was covered. The danger was worsened by the fact that such pits were easy to ignore until they became impossible to ignore. Out of sight encouraged neglect. Yet the buried waste did not become harmless simply because it was hidden. Medieval sanitation repeatedly returned to this uncomfortable truth. Concealment was not the same as removal. There were also diseases tied more directly to water contamination, though medieval people did not map them in our terms. Dysentery, chronic stomach illness, fevers associated with poor conditions, parasitic infections, and various intestinal troubles were part of life in environments where waste and water were never fully separated. Not every illness came from bad sanitation, of course. Medieval bodies were vulnerable to a huge range of threats, including malnutrition, respiratory disease, infected wounds, childbirth complications, and epidemic outbreaks arriving through trade and travel. But poor sanitation weakened the background conditions of life. It strained digestion, disrupted sleep, wore down domestic order, and made recovery harder when sickness did come. Filth was not always the single cause. Often it was the constant accomplice. What makes this especially revealing is that the daily experience of sanitation did not distribute risk equally. The wealthy could sometimes place their latrines farther from wells, hire labor to empty pits, obtain cleaner water, and separate living spaces more effectively. They could retreat from some of the densest concentrations of urban waste. The poor could not. A laborer's family living in cramped rented quarters near workshops, animals, and shared yards had fewer choices. The same quantity of waste became more dangerous when many bodies had to live close together around it. Children suffered especially under those conditions. So did the elderly. So did anyone already weakened by hunger or overwork. The disgusting toilet was therefore also a quiet instrument of inequality. It reminded every medieval town that rank could shape even the smell of the air one breathed. Hospitals and infirmaries, limited though they were by modern standards, also reveal this awareness. Medieval caregivers often prized fresh air, clean bedding when possible, and separation from obvious sources of foulness. Again, their reasons were framed through their own medical models, but the practical result could still point toward better conditions. A place that was airy, dry, and orderly seemed healthier than one that was close, damp, and rank. This is not because medieval institutions had solved the problem. Far from it. Rather, it shows that sanitation pressures pushed even learned and religious communities toward the same broad conclusion. Some environments made bodies fail more quickly than others. The same concern appears in moments of crisis. During outbreaks of epidemic disease, towns did not suddenly discover filth for the first time. What changed was the intensity of fear. Under ordinary circumstances, a foul lane or overflowing ditch might be tolerated because daily routines had to continue. During a scare, that same place could become charged with menace. Authorities might order streets cleaned, offal removed, stagnant matter burned or carted away, and movement more tightly controlled. These responses were not always effective, and they were often mixed with measures that had little real value. But they show something important. Sanitation became more visible precisely when fear rose. The normal background discomfort of medieval toilets and waste systems turned, in moments of illness, into something that seemed to threaten the body politic itself. This becomes especially interesting when we think about the Black Death, not because bad toilets caused it in any simple way, they did not, but because the plague changed how communities noticed filth. The plague's true transmission dynamics were far more complex than any medieval observer could know. Yet, in the wake of so much death, many towns became more sensitive to environment, air, crowding, and public order. When fear overwhelms explanation, people search for tangible surfaces of control. Streets can be swept, pits can be emptied, rules can be issued, waste can be moved. These acts did not solve the plague, but they gave form to a desperate hope that human neglect might be corrected before more bodies failed. It is another reminder that the toilet story is never only about convenience. It is about the human desire to reclaim some order from conditions that feel deeply unstable. There is also a more domestic scale to this story, one that matters precisely because it is less dramatic. Illness in a medieval household transformed the sanitary burden overnight. A healthy person might manage the yard privy or chamber pot without much comment. A sick person might not. Vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, fever, and immobility all forced waste and washing closer into the home. Bedding had to be changed or aired. Water had to be fetched more often. Soiled cloth had to be dealt with. Floors, straw, benches, and clothing all became part of the problem. For a household with little spare labor and limited fuel for heating water, this was exhausting. A single illness could therefore expose how fragile everyday cleanliness really was. What seemed manageable in health became overwhelming in sickness. This is one reason medieval sanitation should be thought of not only as infrastructure, but as labor discipline. Someone had to do the carrying, scrubbing, emptying, rinsing, fetching, digging, and airing. In many households, much of that burden fell on women, servants, children, and low-status workers whose effort often disappears from grand historical narratives. The elegant stone castle, the prosperous market town, the orderly monastery, even the noble manor all depended on repetitive cleaning work that was physically tiring and rarely celebrated. If that labor was delayed by weather, interrupted by illness, or reduced by poverty, sanitation deteriorated quickly. The disgusting toilet was therefore not just an engineering failure. It was often the visible outcome of hidden labor stretched to its limit. And while much of the story centers on Europe, the deeper lesson is not that medieval people were uniquely dirty. It is that sanitation across history has always depended on what a society can build, maintain, and normalize. Some medieval communities preserved or developed better water management than others. Some towns had more effective regulations. Some monastic houses were impressively organized. Some castles had better designed garderobes than their neighbors. Variation matters. The medieval period was not one uniform sea of filth. Yet the overall pattern remains clear. In much of medieval life, waste stayed too near the human body for too long, and that nearness shaped everything from architecture to illness to social status. If we return to the town street, the sensory reality becomes easier to imagine. A narrow lane lined with timber houses might hold household refuse, animal droppings, spilled brewing remnants, kitchen waste, and runoff from nearby work. A privy in the rear yard might leak or fill. A shared drain might carry material slowly, or not at all. After rain, the ground becomes a mixture. In dry heat, odor settles low in the air. Flies gather. Dogs nose through scraps. Children move around all of this because they have no choice. Adults step around it because the day's work still has to be done. Trade continues. Bells ring. Bread is baked. Contracts are made. This is part of what makes the history so layered. People built culture, devotion, law, and commerce in conditions that could be physically nauseating. There is a temptation to ask how anyone tolerated it. But that question can mislead us, because tolerance grows from familiarity and necessity. Medieval people did not stand outside their world comparing it hourly to modern plumbing. They adjusted their expectations to what was normal, just as every society does. Smells that would revolt a visitor might register differently to a resident habituated over years. That said, habituation had limits. Records of complaints, lawsuits, regulations, and moral commentary show that people did object when conditions became excessive. Neighbors argued over blocked drains. Authorities fined people for dumping. Religious and medical writings returned again and again to the dangers of corruption and foulness. The point is not that people accepted filth happily. It is that they accepted it reluctantly, unequally, and often without a realistic path out. Sometimes the disgustiveness of medieval toilets lay in simple practical details that rarely appear in romantic images of the period. Ventilation, for example, was inconsistent. A privy tucked into a thick wall or enclosed yard could trap foul air in still weather. Lighting was poor, making cleaning harder and accidents more likely. Wood absorbed moisture and smell. Stones stayed cold and damp. Textile hangings, rushes on floors, and clothing all picked up odors from surrounding space. Insects were a constant nuisance. Rats and other vermin could thrive where food scraps and waste overlapped. None of this required a spectacular sanitary disaster. It was enough that materials themselves retained the traces of use. The built environment remembered waste. Weather, too, kept rewriting the problem. A hot summer transformed pits and drains into richer sources of stench. A hard winter could freeze surfaces but not eliminate underlying accumulation. Spring rains disturbed buried filth and spread it through yards and low streets. Flooding was worst of all because it erased boundaries. Once a river or drainage channel overflowed, what had been separated only imperfectly became mixed without restraint. Latrine contents, dung heaps, household refuse, workshop waste, and mud entered the same moving mass. After the water withdrew, it left behind a landscape that required immense labor to make merely usable again. Medieval toilets were disgusting on ordinary days. In bad weather, they became part of a much wider environmental breakdown. One subtle but important result of all this was the way sanitation shaped movement through space. People learned where not to step, which lanes smelled worst, which corners collected runoff, which yards had overflowing pits, which bridges stood near foul channels, and which routes were worth taking even if longer. A town was therefore experienced not only through property lines and landmarks, but through invisible maps of cleanliness and danger. The privy, drain, dung heap, and water source formed an everyday geography of caution. That geography also affected reputation. Some districts were known as unhealthy, some houses as badly kept, some neighbors as careless. Sanitation left marks on social memory. And that social memory could matter economically. Markets depended on attracting buyers. Pilgrimage sites depended on receiving visitors. Inns depended on tolerable conditions. A foul-smelling street near a place of trade was more than offensive. It threatened business. This helps explain why urban authorities so often targeted waste around commercially important zones. Cleanliness, even if incomplete, had value. It protected reputation, encouraged traffic, and signaled that a town exercised some degree of order. In this sense, the medieval toilet touches even the history of commerce. A settlement that could not manage its filth at all risked not just discomfort but diminished standing. Yet there is another quiet twist here. Medieval sanitation problems sometimes preserved evidence for modern historians in ways far grander subjects did not. Cesspits, latrine deposits, and household waste layers can reveal diet, trade goods, parasites, textile fragments, seeds, pottery, and the hidden routines of ordinary life. What once disgusted medieval residents now helps scholars reconstruct their world. The very pits they wished did not exist can tell us what people ate, what they imported, what objects they used, how their guts suffered, and how closely their households lived with the byproducts of survival. It is an oddly intimate archive. Waste, buried and forgotten, becomes one of the most candid witnesses the Middle Ages have left behind. And those witnesses keep pointing toward the same conclusion. The medieval toilet was never just about bodily relief. It stood at the intersection of architecture, labor, medicine, class, weather, water, and fear. It exposed what a household could manage and what it could not. It revealed whether a town's rules meant anything in practice. It showed how thin the line was between ordinary discomfort and unhealthy collapse. And perhaps most striking of all, it forced every level of society, from the poorest tenant to the lord in his chamber, into the same unignorable dependence on systems that were fragile, foul, and always at risk of failure. The next step is to look even more closely at those systems themselves, at cesspits, street cleaning, night soil removal, and the stubborn everyday mechanics that kept medieval settlements functioning just enough to go on living beside their own waste. Those mechanics were easy to ignore when they worked, and impossible to ignore when they did not. A medieval town survived not because it had solved the problem of waste, but because people performed an endless sequence of small, unpleasant tasks that prevented the problem from becoming immediately catastrophic. Cesspits had to be dug, monitored, and eventually emptied. Street channels had to be scraped clear. Refuse had to be carted away from markets and homes. Public areas had to be swept, at least irregularly. Water sources had to be protected as best they could. None of this was glamorous, and almost none of it produced the kind of clean certainty modern people expect from sanitation. What it produced instead was a fragile tolerability, a condition in which daily life could continue, though never without discomfort. The cesspit was at the center of that arrangement. For many households and institutions, it was the unseen stomach of the property, receiving what the surface world could not keep. A privy built over a pit offered a crude kind of order. Waste went down. The user departed. The unpleasantness disappeared from view. Yet the disappearance was temporary. Over days and months, the contents accumulated, settled, fermented, and sometimes shifted in ways that no one above ground wanted to imagine too clearly. If the pit was lined poorly, liquids might seep. If it was shallow, it filled too quickly. If it was placed badly, it threatened nearby structures or water. Even a well-built pit only postponed the moment when someone had to confront what had been gathering below. That confrontation usually arrived in the form of labor done at night, and not by accident. Night soil removal, as later periods would also know it, was sensible after dark because streets were quieter, markets were closed, and fewer people had to witness or smell the work at close range. Carts could move with less obstruction. Laborers could shovel from pits into barrels or containers and haul the contents away while the rest of the town slept or tried to. The darkness also helped preserve a degree of civic dignity. Daylight would have made the entire process more visible, and visibility mattered. Medieval communities lived close to filth, but they still preferred not to stage its movement as a public spectacle if it could be avoided. And yet the secrecy of night does not make the work itself any less revealing. To empty a cesspit was to uncover the hidden underside of settled life. A household might present itself by its frontage, by its craft, by its painted signs or respectable neighbors. But below that appearance sat a concentrated record of bodily necessity. Workers descended into spaces few others would willingly enter. They inhaled gases rising from decomposed waste. They shoveled compacted matter that had thickened with time. They risked slipping, splashing, suffocation, and illness. It was among the dirtiest labor medieval towns required, and like so much essential labor, it was easiest for respectable society to ignore until it stopped being done. There is an important historical irony here. The more successful a town became, the more it depended on this hidden workforce. More residents meant more pits, fuller pits, and more frequent removal. Inns, monasteries, workshops, wealthy homes, and rented lodgings all produced waste at scales that private household routines could not always manage. Urban growth, therefore, made sanitation more collective even when property remained individual. One man could own the house. One family could occupy the rooms. But the waste system increasingly implicated carters, diggers, ward officials, neighbors, landlords, and anyone downstream or downhill. A cesspit was private in location, but public in consequence. That consequence was not limited to smell. The practical hazards of pit emptying shaped how and where waste could be reused or discarded. In some cases, human waste might eventually be used in agriculture, especially where land lay near enough and transport made sense. But this was not a neat, universal recycling system, and it certainly did not erase the disgust involved. The gap between the pit under the privy and the field beyond the town was filled with heavy hauling, spillage, judgment, and risk. Material had to go somewhere, and every somewhere had people nearby who might object. Medieval sanitation often turned on this simple fact. Waste did not disappear when it left the house. It merely became someone else's proximity problem. Street cleaning followed the same logic of partial success. A road through a medieval town was not just a path for feet and carts. It was also a drainage surface, a dumping temptation, an animal corridor, a commercial zone, and sometimes the nearest available place for what householders wanted gone. If the street sloped, rain might help move the filth, though often to another unfortunate spot. If it was flat, mud and waste could settle stubbornly. Paving helped where it existed, but paving itself needed maintenance and did not create sanitation out of nothing. Stones could trap foul matter in gaps. Gutters could clog. A clean-looking surface one day might become rancid after rain, market traffic, and a few neglected chamber pots. Urban authorities sometimes tried to assign responsibility in pieces. Each householder might be expected to keep the frontage of a property reasonably clear. Certain occupations might be forbidden to dump near particular public areas. Neighborhood watches or ward officers might inspect trouble spots. Fines might be imposed for blocking drains or piling dung where it interfered with passage. All of this suggests a town attempting to distribute a collective burden through local obligation. But such systems always rested on uneven foundations. Wealthier citizens could hire help. Poorer ones could not. Some landlords neglected repairs. Some tenants moved frequently and had little incentive to maintain shared spaces. Some trades generated unavoidable filth simply by existing. A regulation might express an ideal of civic order, yet the physical town often resisted that ideal at every turn. If you imagine a market day, the tension becomes clearer. People arrived with carts, baskets, animals, produce, cloth, tools, and coin. They crowded streets that were already burdened by ordinary urban residue. Food was displayed in places where waste might recently have passed. Animals stood where customers walked. Offcuts, spoiled produce, trampled straw, and dung could accumulate quickly. Yet the market had to look active, prosperous, and reasonably manageable. It was the economic heart of the settlement. So sanitation became partly theatrical. Sweeping before an event mattered. Removing visible refuse mattered. Clearing the obvious mess mattered, not because deeper cleanliness had been achieved, but because enough order had to be presented for commercial life to continue with confidence. That distinction between visible and invisible filth runs through the whole history. Medieval people were often highly attentive to what could be seen, smelled, and stepped in. The invisible pathways of contamination, by contrast, were harder to grasp fully, even when their effects were felt. A well might appear clean while receiving seepage from nearby ground. A yard privy might seem contained while slowly affecting the environment around it. Water drawn from a stream might look usable in one light and suspicious in another. This is why sanitation could be both a matter of daily complaint and a matter of recurring surprise. People knew they were surrounded by waste. What they could not always know was when that waste had crossed into a source or space that still looked ordinary. The management of public water, therefore, became inseparable from toilet history. Wells had to be sited with some thought, yet medieval towns were not blank slates waiting for rational design. They grew by accretion. A well dug in one generation could become dangerously close to new structures, new pits, or heavier population in the next. A stream that once served a small settlement could become overloaded when the town expanded upstream and downstream at once. Even access to cleaner water could create social hierarchy. Better positioned houses, monastic compounds, or wealthier districts might enjoy a more reliable supply, while poorer residents depended on more vulnerable sources or had to carry water from farther away. Once again, the disgusting toilet reflects something larger. It reveals how infrastructure distributes dignity. There is also a quieter human detail worth noticing. Sanitation took time, and time in medieval life was precious. Fetching water, emptying vessels, carrying waste, sweeping yards, washing cloths, checking pits, and managing domestic mess all consumed hours that could not be spent spinning, baking, mending, trading, tending animals, or resting. The filth of medieval toilets was not just sensory. It was temporal. It stole effort from households already operating near the edge of fatigue. In this sense, better sanitation was not merely about health. It was about freedom from constant low-level interruption. A home that handled waste badly did not just smell worse. It demanded more labor every day. This helps explain why monasteries and some larger institutions, despite their own limitations, sometimes appear comparatively efficient in the records and archaeology. Institutional life could pool labor and impose routine. Latrines could be built for repeated use. Drains could be maintained according to schedule. Refectories, dormitories, and infirmaries could be arranged in relation to one another with more foresight than an ordinary townhouse allowed. Yet even here there was no escaping the material truth. A monastic latrine block might look impressively organized in plan, but organization did not neutralize volume. A community of dozens or hundreds still produced a steady stream of waste. Channels clogged, water varied, smells rose. The achievement was relative control, not modern cleanliness. Castles, too, demonstrate the same tension between ingenuity and insufficiency. A garderobe chute could drop waste away from the chamber and preserve some degree of indoor dignity. It could be placed in a projecting turret for easier discharge. It might be built near private apartments or in more communal zones depending on rank and architectural logic. But no arrangement changed the fact that gravity merely moved the problem. Somewhere below, beyond, or within the wall circuit, accumulation remained. If a castle stood above a moat or river, one might imagine nature itself carrying the waste away, yet nature did so without concern for health, smell, or downstream use. The elegant solution was often only elegant to the person sitting above the chute. For those below, nearby, or later tasked with cleaning, it was something else entirely. There were defensive consequences, too. In some contexts, latrine chutes and waste outlets created structural vulnerabilities or undesirable access points, small but not entirely trivial in fortress design. More commonly, the issue was environmental. Waste collecting near the base of walls added foulness to already unpleasant defensive landscapes. During extended occupation, the area around such discharge points could become deeply offensive. The castle, so often imagined as an emblem of controlled power, was in this respect surprisingly helpless. Stone walls could resist siege engines better than they could solve sanitation. The privy remained a reminder that no amount of military prestige exempted a household from the slow pressure of biology. The same lesson appears in seigneurial manors and manor courts. A lord might regulate tenants, collect rents, and claim rights over land and labor, but everyday sanitation still depended on the ordinary conduct of many people. Villages with poor drainage, overused yards, and badly positioned pits could become unhealthy even under strong local authority. A manor's own facilities might be better built than those of nearby peasants, but the wider environment still mattered. Roads, fields, watercourses, and common spaces linked everyone together. Medieval waste was profoundly democratic in one bleak sense. It traveled, and as it traveled, it mixed with the other outputs of human settlement. This is where the toilet merges with the workshop. Tanning, dyeing, fulling, butchery, brewing, smithing, and other trades produced runoff, scraps, ash, blood, spoiled liquid, and strong odors of their own. A town did not suffer only from sewage. It suffered from accumulation. Human waste was embedded in a much broader material flow of substances people wanted removed from the center of life but still had to generate to survive. The latrine was therefore disgusting partly because it belonged to a whole economy of unwanted matter. The medieval street was not overwhelmed by one source of filth. It was burdened by many, all pressing at once. This creates one of the most revealing contrasts with the romantic Middle Ages of later imagination. In art and memory, the medieval town often appears as a place of stone churches, gilt banners, timber facades, and lively squares. All of that is true enough at one level, but beneath and beside it ran an equally important history of clearance, scraping, hauling, and decomposition. Civic beauty and civic filth coexisted. The bell tower rose above the cesspit. The procession passed the drain. The merchant's respectable frontage stood not far from a yard whose sanitation may have been failing. This does not make medieval culture hypocritical. It makes it real. Human societies have often built grandeur next to unpleasant necessity. Archaeology has made this reality almost uncomfortably vivid. Excavated cesspits and latrine deposits preserve traces of diet, disease, parasites, household breakage, textile fragments, seeds, animal bones, and lost objects. Rings, pins, knives, scraps of leather, and broken pottery sometimes found their way into the same deposits as excrement. In practical terms, this tells us that toilets and pits were not perfectly separate from the rest of household life. Things were dropped, swept, discarded, or mistakenly lost. The privy became an accidental archive of error and routine. More than that, the preserved remains of intestinal parasites and food waste remind us that medieval disgust operated on a biological level beyond what many residents could fully see. The pit held secrets the nose detected before the eye or the mind could explain them. The human body, again, sits at the center of this. Parasites, chronic bowel troubles, and digestive instability were not rare abstractions. They could be repeated facts of life in environments where contamination circulated persistently. A poorly maintained latrine was therefore not only offensive in the moment. It could contribute to longer chains of weakness, discomfort, and lowered resilience. This is another important moderation of the topic. Medieval toilets were disgusting not simply because they shocked modern sensibilities, but because they likely made medieval life harder for medieval people too. The body paid a price for the closeness of waste, even if that price was understood through different medical language. At the household level, all of this meant that cleanliness was often episodic rather than continuous. A room might be swept, aired, and made tolerable, only for smell to return through nearby use, damp weather, or a neglected vessel. A yard might be cleared before a feast day or visit, then slowly relapse into disorder. A pit might function adequately for months and then suddenly become urgent. Sanitation came in cycles of attention and drift. That rhythm is important because it keeps us from imagining medieval life as either uniformly squalid or unexpectedly pristine. It was unstable. It moved between effort and backsliding. The toilet story is, in many ways, the story of that instability. And instability made memory sharp. People remembered the house with the bad pit, the lane where runoff collected, the inn-yard that always smelled sour in summer, the drain that blocked after storms, the neighbor who dumped waste carelessly, the institution known for better order, the monastery whose channels worked more effectively, the castle corner one avoided in hot weather. These local memories formed practical knowledge. Sanitation, in other words, was learned socially. Residents taught one another where risk and discomfort gathered. They developed habits of avoidance. They passed on complaints. Over time, such habits shaped the experience of place as much as walls, rents, or markets did. All of this brings us toward an even more intimate question, one that is less about infrastructure than about daily bodily experience. Once we have seen how pits were managed, how streets were kept barely passable, and how towns lived beside a constant tide of waste, the next thing to ask is what it actually felt like to use these spaces day after day, to sit in a freezing wall latrine, to carry a chamber pot through a cramped house, to visit a communal block with little privacy, and to endure the smells, textures, sounds, and small indignities that made medieval sanitation not just unhealthy or inconvenient, but personally miserable in ways that written regulations can only hint at. Those written regulations can only hint at the lived reality because the true discomfort of medieval sanitation was often immediate, physical, and repetitive. It was in the cold stone seat that seemed to pull warmth straight out of the body on a winter morning. It was in the dark trip across a yard after rain, when mud, puddles, and refuse had merged into one uncertain surface. It was in the effort of lifting clothing layers quickly enough in a cramped space that did not feel secure or private. It was in the smell that met a person before they had even reached the latrine opening. And perhaps most of all, it was in the knowledge that this was not an occasional inconvenience but part of ordinary life, something to be managed over and over again with no real hope of making it pleasant. The cold deserves more attention than it usually gets. Modern people often imagine filth through smell and sight, but in medieval Europe, temperature was equally important. A privy in winter could be a place of real misery. Stone held cold mercilessly. Wooden seats, if present, were little comfort in a drafty space. A garderobe set into a castle wall might be exposed to gusts of freezing air. An outdoor privy in a village or town yard required stepping away from the hearth, from bed, and from whatever little comfort the household could provide. For the sick, the elderly, children, or anyone weakened by labor and poor diet, this was more than annoying. Could be genuinely punishing. The toilet was a place where the body became vulnerable in the most ordinary way. And then there was the opposite problem. In hot weather, enclosed latrines could become almost unbearable. A pit warmed by summer heat, poorly ventilated and heavily used, would produce a dense and lingering odor. Flies multiplied. The air thickened. Surfaces felt damp or sticky. A wall shaft in a castle or urban privy in a crowded court might trap foulness in a way that turned a short visit into a memorable ordeal. Even people habituated to bad smells would have noticed the difference between a tolerable day and an oppressive one. Summer did not merely reveal the problem. It amplified it, making the whole environment seem more decayed than it had in cooler weather. The sounds of these places are also worth imagining, because they change the emotional texture of the experience. A communal latrine was not silent. Water might trickle beneath some monastic facilities, but there were also coughs, shifting feet, clothing being adjusted, wooden seats creaking, conversation in some settings, and the unmistakable bodily sounds that modern privacy usually shields from others. In a household, chamber pots could be heard at night. Doors opened. Floors creaked. Someone moving through the dark with a vessel full of waste could not always do so quietly. The loss of privacy was not just visual. It was acoustic. People knew more about one another's bodily routines than many modern audiences would find comfortable to imagine. That discomfort was not evenly distributed. Rank, gender, age, and health all changed how a person experienced the toilet. A high-status individual might enjoy a more private garderobe or a chamber pot attended by servants. But privacy purchased through status still rested on the labor of others, and it often did little to improve the facility itself beyond convenience. A woman navigating long clothing in a difficult space faced one set of problems. A pregnant woman, an injured soldier, or a frail old man faced another. Children might fear dark outdoor privies or struggle to use adult-sized seats safely. A servant responsible for emptying vessels experienced the toilet not only as a user, but as an extension of daily work. The same sanitary system could humiliate one person, chill another, and physically exhaust a third. Women's experience in particular is easy to lose in broad descriptions of medieval sanitation, yet it mattered enormously. Privacy was often less available to women not because they cared less about it, but because domestic and communal settings placed them under constant observation. The practical demands of menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth recovery, and child care made access to clean water, cloth, and private washing especially important, while medieval infrastructure made those needs harder to meet consistently. A badly placed privy, an overused chamber pot, or a household with too little spare cloth turned ordinary bodily maintenance into a much heavier burden. The medieval toilet, in that sense, was part of a wider history of how women managed bodies in environments not built around comfort or autonomy. Men, of course, did not escape discomfort simply because their clothing could make some acts easier. Soldiers in camps or castles, craftsmen in busy town houses, clerics in shared institutions, and peasants in small villages all faced their own forms of exposure and inconvenience. The idea that men in pre-modern societies somehow lived in robust indifference to filth misses the more ordinary truth. They may have tolerated more than many modern viewers, but tolerance is not the same as ease. A freezing latrine in a drafty wall, a reeking shared privy after a feast, or a yard pit visited in darkness after a day of hard labor still represented one more unpleasant task in a life already full of them. One of the more revealing details is the sheer awkwardness of movement. Toilets are easy to take for granted when space is generous and surfaces are smooth. Medieval life rarely offered that luxury. A path to the privy could involve stairs, ladders, uneven boards, muddy passages, or crowded interiors. In castles and larger houses, a latrine might sit at the edge of a chamber or behind a narrow passage. In poorer homes, there might be no proper latrine at all, only the routine use of vessels that then had to be managed. For anyone ill, injured, elderly, drunk, frightened, or carrying a child, the journey itself could be hazardous. This is a practical detail, but it matters because discomfort does not begin at the seat. It begins in access. The danger of accidents should not be understated. Spilling a chamber pot indoors was not merely embarrassing. It created immediate work, odor, and contamination in a room that was already difficult to clean thoroughly. Slipping near a pit or in a muddy yard could turn a necessary task into a degrading and physically risky event. Poor lighting increased all of this. A candle or rushlight might not be worth the effort or expense for every nighttime visit. So people moved by memory, by touch, and by habit, which worked most of the time until it did not. Medieval sanitation therefore carried a quiet but constant possibility of mishap, not dramatic enough for chronicles, but common enough to shape daily caution. The chamber pot itself deserves closer attention because it was one of the most intimate objects in medieval domestic life. It sat near the bed or within the room, often used during the hours when the rest of the household was close by. It reduced the danger of going outside at night, but it brought waste directly into the sleeping space. For a modern audience, that may be the single most jarring detail. Yet, from a medieval perspective, it was a compromise between safety, warmth, convenience, and sanitation. The problem, again, came in the morning. Until it was emptied, the vessel remained a stored insult to the senses. In a crowded room with smoke from the hearth, stale bedding, damp clothing, and limited ventilation, that insult did not pass unnoticed. There is also the question of texture, a small detail that history often avoids because it feels too personal, but one that would have mattered deeply to the people living it. Rough wiping materials, damp cloth, poorly washed hands, seats splintered by use, frozen surfaces in winter, insects in summer, and the persistent dampness of some privy spaces all contributed to the experience. Medieval toilets were disgusting not only because of grand sanitary failure, but because the body encountered discomfort through touch again and again. Even small improvements in softness, warmth, dryness, or privacy would have changed the experience dramatically. Their absence made ordinary relief feel harsher than the simple word toilet suggests. This is part of why the subject resists romantic treatment. So much of medieval life is visually seductive from a distance. Stone abbeys, candlelight, timber halls, illuminated manuscripts, castle towers above misty hills. But sanitation forces us to stand much closer. It removes the soft focus. It asks what the corridor smelled like, what the yard felt like after rain, what it meant to sit above a shaft in winter with wind pushing upward, or to share a communal latrine with people one could hear but not avoid. The medieval toilet is not interesting because it is grotesque for its own sake. It is interesting because it cuts through idealized images and returns us to the body, which history can never escape for long. This bodily reality also shaped architecture in surprisingly direct ways. A room near a latrine might be less desirable. A noble chamber could be made more convenient by attaching a garderobe, yet that convenience had to be balanced against smell and structural design. In monasteries, the placement of communal latrines relative to dormitories and refectories affected routine and movement. In towns, rear-yard privies influenced how plots were organized and how neighbors experienced one another's space. The toilet, then, was not an afterthought. Quietly rearranged buildings. It determined where passages led, where drains ran, and where foul air might collect. If we want to know what medieval buildings felt like to inhabit, sanitation is part of the answer. There is a subtle but important twist here. Some of the most disgusting aspects of medieval toilets arose not from neglect alone, but from attempts at improvement that introduced new problems. Enclosing a latrine could protect privacy, yet also trap smell. Building a chute into a wall could move waste away from the chamber, yet create foul air currents or accumulation below. Digging a deeper cesspit could delay emptying, yet make the eventual labor more dangerous. Concentrating use in a communal block could improve organization, yet intensify crowding, noise, and odor in one place. In other words, medieval sanitation was full of trade-offs. People were not merely failing to build better toilets. They were often choosing between imperfect solutions. That same pattern appears in urban water management. A drain that carried liquid waste away from a property could help one household while worsening conditions farther down the lane. A ditch cut to improve runoff might become stagnant in dry weather. A river used to disperse waste might relieve pressure in one district while contaminating another. Every solution shifted the problem geographically. The result was a medieval politics of proximity. Whose yard received the runoff? Whose wall bordered the foul passage? Whose well lay closest to the suspect ground? Whose tenants complained first? Sanitation disputes were often arguments about how discomfort and risk should be distributed. This leads us into the social life of toilets, which may sound like an odd phrase but makes good historical sense. Toilets were not only places of private necessity. They were also places where hierarchy, custom, embarrassment, and sometimes even conversation played out. In monasteries, the communal character of facilities reflected shared discipline. In elite households, access and privacy could signal rank. In inns or other semi-public settings, latrines became part of the experience of hosting strangers in close quarters. In ordinary homes, who emptied the pot, who cleaned the privy, and who had to wait spoke quietly about status. Sanitation was therefore woven into social order. It showed who could avoid the worst of the work and who could not. That social order could become tense when facilities failed. A shared privy in a court or rented urban property required cooperation, and cooperation is rarely most reliable where comfort is lowest. If too many households relied on one pit, if one family neglected cleanliness, or if a landlord refused maintenance, irritation could easily turn into complaint. Medieval records contain no shortage of disputes that circle around nuisance, obstruction, drainage, and fouling. This is not surprising. Waste has always tested the limits of neighborliness. The toilet story is therefore also a story of friction. Between tenants and landlords, between one trade and another, between wealthy householders and poorer neighbors, and between private convenience and public cost. In castles and great houses, servants lived close to these tensions. The noble might enjoy a garderobe attached to a private chamber, but someone else dealt with the consequences. Chamber pots had to be carried away. Seats had to be wiped down. Linen and hand cloths had to be laundered. Spaces had to be aired. If the lord wanted refinement, servants supplied it through constant labor. This is another reason the medieval toilet is historically revealing. It exposes how refinement itself was built on invisible work. A high-status room could seem orderly because low-status people handled the disorder before it became visible. Where that labor weakened, status lost some of its protective power. Monastic communities, by contrast, remind us that collective discipline could normalize even deeply uncomfortable arrangements. A communal latrine visited according to routine could become simply part of monastic time, like prayer, meals, and work. Yet normalization did not erase physical sensation. The cold was still cold. The smell was still the smell. The exposure was still exposure. What changed was interpretation. Shared discomfort could be folded into obedience, regularity, even humility. The body's unglamorous needs became another reminder that no one in the community escaped material dependence. That may help explain why monastic settings could at times manage sanitation relatively well. They had structures for turning inconvenience into habit. A village household handled things differently, with fewer formal structures and more improvisation. There, the toilet problem blended almost seamlessly into the problem of living. Yard space, animals, weather, tools, children, and domestic rhythm all overlapped. A pit might be dug where it made practical sense rather than where it was ideal. A chamber pot might be used because the nearest alternative was too far, too dark, or too cold. A family might postpone cleaning because harvest work, sickness, or bad weather consumed the day. In such settings, disgust often had to compete with necessity, and necessity usually won. This did not make village life uniquely careless. It made it resource-bound, and that idea of resources includes not only labor and water, but material culture itself. Soap existed, but not in the easy abundance familiar to modern consumers. Cloth had value and had to be washed, dried, and reused carefully. Wood, rushes, straw, and moss served many purposes and could not always be devoted solely to comfort or cleanliness. Even the manufacture of better containers, seats, drainage channels, and storage spaces required skill and expense. Medieval sanitation was therefore limited not just by knowledge, but by the cost of making every ordinary item slightly better. When people lacked margins, rough solutions persisted. The persistence of those rough solutions shaped memory and imagination. It is telling that later periods often looked back on medieval sanitation with a mixture of contempt and fascination. Some of that was unfair, because later societies inherited many of the same problems and solved them only gradually. But some of it captured a real truth. The medieval toilet was a place where daily life stripped away ceremony. Whatever one's status, one still entered an uncomfortable space built out of compromise. One still depended on others' labor, on fragile materials, on uncertain weather, and on the hope that pits, drains, and containers were holding a little longer. The difference between dignity and indignity could be very small. That small difference becomes even clearer when we think about night. Night was when households shrank inward. The outside world became riskier. The hearth mattered more. The limits of privacy became sharper. The chamber pot stood close at hand not because it was pleasant, but because it preserved warmth and avoided danger. A trip to an outdoor privy meant darkness, cold, mud, and the possibility of stumbling or meeting others in shared spaces. In castles and monasteries, corridors and stairways carried echoes. In towns, yards and alleys were more threatening after dark. The toilet, then, was entangled with medieval fears of the night itself. Relief came with inconvenience. Convenience came with stored foulness. Neither choice was ideal. And when morning returned, the work returned with it. Pots emptied, surfaces aired, paths crossed again, pits judged, drains noticed, smells assessed. The medieval toilet was never a finished feature. It was a daily process of tolerating, postponing, and correcting. That process could remain merely unpleasant for long stretches, or it could tip into crisis with shocking speed when weather changed, illness entered the house, or population pressure became too great. It is in that tipping point that the next part of the story really takes shape, because once ordinary discomfort became overload, medieval communities were forced to respond. Sometimes with rules, sometimes with ingenuity, sometimes with blame, and sometimes with desperate measures that reveal just how thin the line was between a manageable nuisance and a town beginning to lose control of its own filth. That loss of control is where medieval sanitation becomes especially revealing, because a town did not have to collapse into chaos for people to feel that something had gone badly wrong. All it took was for ordinary routines to fail in sequence. A pit went too long without emptying. Rain came hard and fast. A drain clogged. Animals churned the street. Someone dumped waste where it should not go. A household fell sick and could not manage its own cleaning. A landlord delayed repairs. A shared yard became overused. None of these problems was extraordinary on its own. But together they created the kind of creeping overload that changed how a settlement felt from day to day. The smell deepened. The ground worsened. Complaints multiplied. Walking became harder. Water became more suspect. And the toilet, once merely one unpleasant corner of life, seemed to spread outward into everything. This is one reason medieval authorities were often more reactive than systematic. They tended to intervene when nuisance became visible or politically inconvenient rather than maintaining a fully coherent sanitary program at all times. A blocked lane near a market mattered because merchants complained. Waste near a church or civic building mattered because it offended not only noses but status. A foul ditch close to an important route mattered because outsiders saw it. The ordinary discomfort of poorer back courts or marginal alleys might receive less attention unless the problem spilled into more public space. This was not uniquely medieval, of course. Many societies have cleaned what mattered most to reputation first. But in the medieval town, the gap between managed visibility and unmanaged reality could be especially wide. And here again we find an important twist. Medieval sanitation was not always worst where people were most careless. Sometimes it was worst where density, growth, and success had outrun local arrangements. A busy commercial town could attract more people, more animals, more goods, and more waste than its streets and yards were built to absorb. Houses were subdivided, courtyards filled, extra workshops crowded in. New lodging appeared where older plots had once allowed more air and drainage. In that sense, filth could be the byproduct of vitality. A town that was prospering might smell worse than a poorer and quieter place simply because its material life was more concentrated. Prosperity did not flush waste away. It often produced more of it. This concentration made neighbor disputes almost inevitable. Sanitation is one of those aspects of life that becomes most obvious when other people fail at it. A family might tolerate its own chamber pots, its own yard, its own smells, because necessity and familiarity dull the edge of disgust. But when a neighbor's drain overflowed into shared space, or a nearby privy pit seeped toward a boundary, or a tenant emptied refuse carelessly into a lane used by others, disgust sharpened into grievance. Medieval records repeatedly suggest that people argued not only about property and rents, but about nuisance, overflow, obstruction, and fouling. These disputes matter because they show sanitation moving out of the realm of private embarrassment and into law, reputation, and communal tension. The language of nuisance itself is revealing. It was often not enough to say a thing was dirty. It had to be offensive, obstructive, harmful, or improper in relation to others. Waste became a legal or civic problem when it crossed the line from tolerated necessity to shared burden. That line, of course, was unstable. A small amount of filth in a side lane might be endured. The same amount near a public way, a chapel, a water source, or a market might provoke action. In practice, medieval towns developed a kind of hierarchy of cleanliness. Certain spaces had to appear more controlled than others, even if the infrastructure behind them remained imperfect. The polite face of the settlement depended on shoving unpleasant realities into less visible corners, pits, and routines. But those routines broke down under pressure, and weather was often the trigger. Heavy rain could transform a merely unpleasant district into something almost unmanageable. Gutters overflowed. Mud thickened with manure and waste. Yard privies became harder to reach. Seepage spread. The distinction between solid ground and contaminated ground grew less reliable. After storms, even people who were used to bad conditions might experience the town differently. A lane that was passable and dry weather could become slippery, rancid, and foul underfoot. A drainage ditch that usually carried things away could become a stagnant trap. The toilet was no longer a contained site. The landscape itself became latrine-like. Dry weather created a different kind of strain. When rain was scarce, waste that might otherwise have been diluted or washed onward simply sat. Smells thickened. Dust rose from fouled surfaces. Water supplies shrank or became more heavily used. Cleaning required more effort because every bucket carried to a household had competing purposes. Should water be used for washing cloth, cooking, drinking, brewing, or cleaning a privy? Such choices were not abstract. They shaped the practical limits of hygiene every day. Medieval disgust, then, cannot be understood apart from scarcity. A modern viewer may ask why people did not simply wash more thoroughly or flush more often. The answer, very often, is that water was work. Work, once more, is at the center of everything. A settlement could only remain somewhat bearable if enough labor was continuously directed toward removing the traces of life. That labor often followed status lines so familiar that they almost disappear in broader narratives. Servants emptied vessels. Women managed cloths, children, and domestic spills. Hired workers dug pits and carted refuse. Lower status urban laborers scraped mud and filth from public ways. Religious communities assigned unpleasant duties as part of collective discipline. In every case, the toilet story turns into a story about whose hands kept the visible world tolerable for everyone else. If we ignore that, we miss the real engine of sanitation, which was never the seat or pit alone, but the people behind it. There is a tendency in popular history to imagine that the great divide in medieval life ran between rich and poor, castle and hovel, monastery and village. That divide certainly mattered, but sanitation also reveals smaller, more intimate hierarchies inside each setting. In a wealthy household, not everyone enjoyed the same access to privacy or convenience. The lord's chamber pot was not the servant's chamber pot. The private garderobe was not the shared facility used by retainers. In a monastery, seniority and arrangement of space could shape comfort. In a townhouse, household members, apprentices, and tenants might all rely on the same yard, but experience its burdens differently. The toilet exposes power in miniature. It shows who waits, who cleans, who complains, and who is shielded. This becomes even clearer when we think about lodging and travel. Medieval inns, goose houses, and roadside accommodations had to manage strangers whose habits, health, and numbers varied constantly. That is an especially difficult sanitary situation in any age. A host could not rely on long-established household routines. Visitors might use facilities carelessly, arrive sick, or overwhelm available arrangements during busy seasons. Shared sleeping, limited yard space, and pressure on water and refused disposal meant that temporary accommodation could become particularly unpleasant. The traveling merchant, pilgrim, clerk, or messenger did not merely endure rough roads and uncertain beds. He or she also entered sanitary systems already strained by turnover and crowding. Pilgrimage routes are a useful example. A shrine town that drew large numbers of visitors gained prestige and money, but it also inherited their waste. More bodies meant more food consumed, more animals brought in, more overnight stays, more chamber pots, more pressure on communal latrines, and more strain on local water. Religious importance could therefore produce distinctly earthly problems. The pious destinations still had to deal with overflowing yards and foul lanes. This is one of the steady lessons of sanitation history. Spiritual aspiration, political grandeur, and commercial ambition all remained tethered to the body. No matter how elevated the purpose, someone still had to solve the problem of where everything went afterward. The same bodily tether-bound military life, armies on the move, garrisons in place, and castles under tension all magnified the ordinary challenges of waste. Temporary encampments could become disgusting very quickly if latrine space, drainage, and discipline were poor. A camp full of men, horses, supplies, and stress created a dense field of contamination in remarkably little time. And although the great symbolic image of medieval warfare focuses on banners, armor, and walls, the hidden reality is that armies have always marched with filth close behind them. Soldiers carried their own sanitary problems into every landscape they entered. When discipline slipped, when numbers swelled, or when bad weather hit, the ground itself turned against comfort. This is part of why siege conditions felt so miserable even apart from hunger and fear. Confinement made every ordinary sanitary weakness worse. More people crowded into less space. Routine maintenance became harder. Water access might be restricted. Waste accumulated near living and defensive areas. The air grew heavier. And because tension was constant, the psychological burden of foulness increased too. Smell under siege was not just odor. It became part of a sensory world of exhaustion, anxiety, and loss of control. A reeking garderobe shaft or overflowing corner of a warded yard was a reminder that the fortress was not only besieged from without but burdened from within by the unending needs of bodies. Monastic life, again, offers a contrasting rhythm, though not an escape. Because religious houses often organize time so carefully, they could in some cases prevent sanitary drift from becoming immediate crisis. But even there, strain could appear. A larger community meant more use. A poor water supply made everything harder. Repairs delayed by cost or weather affected daily routine. Illness in an infirmary increased cleaning and waste. Guests added pressure. And beneath the regularity of the cloister lay the same material truth as anywhere else. Routine did not abolish biology. It merely disciplined the response to it. In that sense, monasteries show what control looked like under medieval conditions, and also how limited that control remained. What is especially revealing is how often medieval people seem to have lived with both resignation and irritation at once. That combination may sound contradictory, but it is actually quite familiar. People adapt to the burdens of daily life while still resenting them. A person can know that the yard privy is unavoidable and still hate using it on a freezing night. A town can accept that carts, dung, and runoff are part of commerce and still argue furiously about where refuse is dumped. A servant can treat chamberpot emptying as routine and still find it degrading. Medieval sanitation was full of this emotional doubleness. It was ordinary and it was offensive. It was tolerated and it was complained about. It was necessary and it was never fully acceptable. That doubleness helps explain why later generations so often misunderstood the medieval past. They looked back and saw either grotesque dirt or quaint simplicity. The reality was more complicated. Medieval people were neither cheerfully filthy nor secretly modern in their habits. They inhabited a difficult middle ground in which practical cleanliness mattered but was costly, in which bad smells were feared but hard to eliminate, in which systems existed but were inconsistent, and in which disgust was real even when it could not reshape the built environment very much. The toilet, oddly enough, is one of the best places to see this complexity clearly. It resists comforting myths in both directions. And complexity deepens when we remember that not all medieval settlements were alike. A small village, a commercial town, a bishop's residence, a frontier castle, a prosperous abbey, and a dense port city all handled waste differently. Geography mattered. So did local custom, available materials, water access, climate, and institutional structure. A riverside town with some drainage options faced different challenges from a hill settlement with limited water. A religious house with planned latrines could outperform a crowded urban court divided among renters. A great house with servants could manage appearances better than a peasant cottage. Yet across these differences, one feature remains strikingly consistent. Waste stayed physically and mentally close to people in ways modern life often hides. That closeness shaped the senses. Smell is the most obvious example, but there was also sight. Stained wood, muddy thresholds, dark liquid in gutters, insects rising from damp places, straw soiled by use, and the general visual knowledge that some corners of life were never truly clean. There was hearing, as we have seen, and touch too. Even taste, in the broad sense of air entering the mouth in foul places, belonged to the experience. Medieval sanitation was total in that sense. It did not remain politely in one room. It reached into how the world was perceived. This is one reason the subject is more than a curiosity. It helps us imagine medieval embodiment more honestly. There were attempts, of course, to create pockets of relief. Fresh rushes on floors, better positioned seats, running water beneath latrines where possible, scented herbs, linen cloths, enclosed spaces for high-status use, rules for clearing streets before important events. These things mattered. They made life somewhat more bearable, but they were often local, partial, and temporary. The deeper system still depended on manual removal, limited water, imperfect drains, and the acceptance that much could not be made truly clean. Improvement often meant reducing offensiveness rather than abolishing it. That difference is important. Medieval sanitation was not simply absent. It was constrained. Constrained, too, by knowledge that came from experience rather than modern science. People noticed correlations. Bad-smelling areas seemed unhealthy. Stagnant water seemed dangerous. Crowded, airless rooms felt oppressive. Some houses or districts had worse reputations than others. These judgments were not foolish, even if they did not rest on germ theory. In fact, the medieval concern with corruption, foul air, and environmental imbalance may have led people to make some sound practical choices within a flawed explanatory system. Open the shutters, air the bedding, move refuse away, clear the drain, avoid stagnant places if possible. The problem was not a complete absence of understanding. The problem was that understanding outran capacity only so far. And capacity failed most dramatically when several burdens arrived together. Imagine a crowded household in wet weather, with one or two people ill, a pit nearing full, limited water, children underfoot, and no extra servant or laborer available. Under those conditions, the smallest sanitary task becomes heavier. A chamber pot is not emptied quickly enough. Bedding stays damp. Cloths cannot be washed thoroughly. The path to the privy becomes treacherous. Food preparation occurs in close proximity to stale air and waste. This is not an extraordinary disaster. It is a plausible week in many lives, and it reveals the real cruelty of medieval sanitation. Not always catastrophe, but accumulation. Accumulation also left marks on memory, custom, and even humor, though humor in the period did not soften the material burden. Proverbs, insults, and earthy references remind us that waste was not unspeakable. It was too near daily experience to be fully hidden in language. Yet speaking of it did not neutralize it. If anything, the presence of such references suggests familiarity so deep that the toilet entered metaphor and social comparison. What was shameful, what was low, what smelled bad, what clung, what had to be removed. These ideas all drew power from environments where waste was never abstract. Language carried the stain of lived conditions. At the same time, politeness and refinement worked hard to contain that stain. Elite culture valued ordered chambers, proper service, and the masking of bodily processes wherever possible. Religious culture linked discipline and cleanliness in complex ways, even if not always in our modern sense. Civic authorities valued respectable streets, at least in the most visible areas. All of this indicates an aspiration away from raw physicality, even when daily life kept dragging people back toward it. That tension between aspiration and necessity may be the deepest theme in the whole subject. Medieval people wanted more order than they could fully achieve. The toilet was where that failure became undeniable. And yet, for all this failure, settlements endured. They traded, prayed, governed, loved, fought, built, and remembered while living alongside these burdens. That endurance should not be romanticized, but it should be understood. Human beings are remarkably capable of normalizing discomfort when the alternative is impossible. The medieval toilet was disgusting, yes, but it was also woven into systems of adaptation. Paths were learned, tasks were distributed, complaints were voiced, repairs were made when they could be, small improvements were valued. Life did not wait for ideal conditions. It moved through bad ones, which is why the next layer of the story is so interesting. Once we stop looking only at the toilet as an object and start seeing it as part of a whole chain of domestic adaptation, we begin to notice what medieval people did to cope psychologically and socially with the constant nearness of dirt. How they arranged privacy where they could, how they disguised smell, how they balanced embarrassment with routine, and how the most ordinary act of bodily relief quietly shaped the rhythm of mornings, nights, hospitality, class relations, and even ideas of what it meant for a home, a monastery, or a town to be considered decently ordered rather than intolerably foul. That question of what counted as decently ordered rather than intolerably foul is more important than it may first sound, because it takes us directly into medieval standards themselves. People did not wake each morning expecting the sterile, sealed, deodorized world that modern plumbing eventually made possible. Their threshold for acceptable discomfort was different, but it was not limitless. A household could be poor and still judged slovenly. A monastery could be austere and still expected to maintain order. A noble residence could be magnificent and yet criticized if its private arrangements offended visitors or servants too obviously. In other words, medieval people had sanitary expectations, but those expectations were calibrated to a world where total cleanliness was unattainable. The real social distinction often lay between the manageable and the neglected. That distinction shaped the rhythm of the household from the moment the day began. Morning was, in many respects, the great hour of sanitary reckoning. Night had concentrated bodily needs into vessels, bedding, enclosed rooms, and sleeping spaces. At dawn, or soon after, the invisible labor of restoring tolerability began. Chamber pots were carried out. Windows or shutters might be opened where weather allowed. Straw, rushes, or cloths were adjusted. Floors were swept. Air was let in if possible, though fresh air itself could be cold, damp, or unpleasant depending on the season. The household had to transition from the close, stale world of sleeping bodies to the more public world of work, meals, visitors, and trade. That transition depended heavily on how quickly and thoroughly the traces of the night could be managed. This is one reason privacy in medieval life should never be imagined as simply absent. It existed, but in more fragile and negotiated forms. A curtain, a side chamber, a well-timed moment, an attached garderobe, a screened corner, or the social expectation that others would avert their eyes all created pockets of personal space. Yet these were provisional defenses, not sealed boundaries. A person might achieve modest privacy while using a chamber pot or visiting a latrine, only to lose it again when the vessel was carried out by someone else, or when the shared yard or communal block drew them back into collective space. Medieval sanitation, therefore, reveals a constant exchange between concealment and exposure. What one could hide briefly, one could not fully remove from the notice of others. That exchange was especially delicate in matters of hospitality. To host a guest in the medieval world meant more than offering food and bed space. It also meant managing the less visible aspects of bodily life in a way that preserved dignity. If a guest had to use an unpleasant shared facility, or if a chamber pot remained too long in a sleeping room, or if the route to the privy was muddy, foul, or unsafe, the failure was not merely practical. It touched the reputation of the host. Clean linen, decent ventilation, orderly service, and reasonably discreet sanitary arrangements all contributed to the impression of a well-run house. The irony, of course, is that achieving that impression depended on precisely the kinds of labor most polite households preferred not to mention. That hidden labor had a strong psychological dimension as well as a physical one. Much of what kept medieval sanitation bearable relied on timing and anticipation. Someone had to notice when a pit was nearing capacity, when a vessel had lingered too long, when bedding needed airing, when a yard was becoming offensive, when a shared space had to be swept before it embarrassed the household. Good order was often preventive rather than dramatic. A decently run home or institution did not wait until every smell became unbearable. It tried, within its means, to stay just ahead of decline. That is another subtle historical twist. What made some medieval spaces seem more refined was not the absence of dirt, but the success of routine in holding dirt at bay for a little longer. And routine itself could become a form of emotional protection. Repetition dulls disgust. Not completely, but enough to make hard tasks survivable. A servant emptying pots each morning, a monk walking the same route to the latrine block, a peasant stepping carefully across the same wet yard, or a townswoman managing children, cloths, and washing water within a cramped domestic space all learned patterns that reduced uncertainty. The work remained unpleasant, yet it became legible. People knew how much time it took, where the worst smells gathered, when the safest moment was to empty a vessel, which corner of a yard dried first after rain, which cloths were reserved for which tasks. Sanitation, in this sense, was not just infrastructure. It was memory and habit embedded in the body. This bodily knowledge shaped how homes were judged. A household that smelled fresher, looked more orderly, or presented fewer obvious signs of neglect might be admired even if its underlying sanitary system was still quite rudimentary. That tells us something important about medieval notions of respectability. The goal was often not pristine purity but controlled appearance and tolerable atmosphere. A floor strewn with fresh rushes might still hide deep dirt beneath. A chamber might be aired and perfumed even if the attached garderobe remained unpleasant. A swept yard could still contain a pit that would soon need emptying. Yet these improvements mattered. They created the sense that life was under management, that the household had not simply surrendered to filth. There is a useful lesson here about smell and social meaning. Smell is often more immediate than sight, and it travels more freely through walls, cloth, and class distinctions than people would like. A bad smell could expose a household's weakness to anyone entering or passing nearby. It could betray overcrowding, poor maintenance, recent illness, or insufficient labor. This helps explain why medieval people invested so much effort in masking or dispersing odor where possible. Herbs, flowers, smoke, incense, fresh rushes, open shutters, and strategic placement of spaces were all small acts of resistance against the fact that bad smells carried social information. To smell orderly was, in a modest but meaningful sense, to seem competent. Yet the need to seem competent could also create anxiety. If sanitation was only partly manageable, then every household lived with the possibility of exposure. A guest might notice the stale chamber. A neighbor might complain about runoff. A visiting superior might find the monastic facilities below expectation. A prospective tenant or marriage ally might form a poor impression of a house. Even in a world accustomed to bodily realities, embarrassment remained potent. The toilet was not only disgusting in a material sense. It was socially dangerous because it threatened the presentation of order. The line between decent and disgraceful could be crossed by something as mundane as an unemptied vessel, a blocked privy, or a yard left too long after illness. Illness itself often sharpened these judgments. A healthy household could present a kind of rough competence. An ill household quickly revealed its limits. Sickbeds, soiled linen, extra washing, reduced labor, and the inability to maintain normal routines all brought sanitation problems closer to the center of domestic life. In that state, embarrassment and necessity collided. People had to manage bodily functions more openly, often with the help of relatives, servants, or religious caregivers. The presence of sickness made privacy harder, odors more persistent, and social boundaries more fragile. It also reminded everyone that control was provisional. A home that seemed decently ordered one week could feel overwhelmed the next if fever or stomach illness spread through it. The same fragility appears in child-rearing. Children made households lively, but they also complicated every sanitary routine. They needed watching, cleaning, teaching, and often carrying. They were less capable of managing urgent bodily needs neatly or safely. They created more washing, more spills, more soiled cloth, and more reasons for adults to interrupt other tasks. In a modern house with reliable water, sealed surfaces, and abundant laundry, this is manageable though still tiring. In a medieval house, it could be exhausting. The presence of several young children might mean that the sanitary burden was not an occasional nuisance but a near-constant cycle. That burden fell especially hard on the women and servants whose labor stitched together the illusion of domestic order. It is worth pausing there, because the history of medieval toilets is also the history of whose work was naturalized. The more repetitive and intimate the task, the less likely it was to be celebrated. Carrying slops, washing cloths, cleaning benches, sweeping corners, checking bedding, airing rooms, managing water, cleaning children, caring for the sick, and quietly correcting all the small failures of bodily life were rarely written up as achievements. Yet without them, every household would have slid much faster toward intolerable foulness. This is one of the reasons the subject feels so revealing. It shines light on the maintenance labor that held medieval society together beneath its more visible institutions. In a noble house, the same truth appears in a different form. Grandeur depended on concealment. The Lord's chamber, the decorated hall, the orderly service at table, the polished courtesy shown to guests. All of it relied on keeping the baser realities of the body just out of sight. A private garderobe was useful not because it solved sanitation, but because it kept necessity from interrupting status too obviously. Chamber attendants, laundresses, and household servants absorbed the consequences. If the house functioned well, refinement appeared natural. If it functioned badly, the gap between noble image and bodily reality became impossible to ignore. The bad smell creeping from a passage or the neglected state of a privy could puncture dignity with startling speed. Monastic life approached the same challenge through discipline rather than display. Order was a moral and practical ideal. A well-run religious house valued regularity in meals, prayer, washing, bedtimes, movement, and work. Sanitation, therefore, became part of obedience. The latrine was visited in an organized rhythm. Water use was structured. Spaces were maintained according to rule where resources allowed. Yet here too the system depended on continual effort. A communal facility could become deeply unpleasant if routine slipped. Illness could disrupt order. Repairs could lag. Smells could still overwhelm. The difference was that monastic culture offered a language for absorbing discomfort into duty. The body's inconveniences became part of collective humility rather than merely private frustration. That does not mean the discomfort disappeared emotionally. Even disciplined communities were made of sensing bodies. Cold still bit. Smells still clung. Shared latrines still exposed one person to another's bodily rhythms. A useful way to think about medieval sanitation is that social frameworks changed how disgust was interpreted, not whether it existed. A servant might interpret privy cleaning as work. A monk might interpret communal discomfort as part of the rule. A noble might interpret a private garderobe as a rightful convenience. A peasant might interpret a muddy yard as unavoidable. The body still felt the same rough wood, the same chill, the same stink. Culture decided what could be complained about and what had to be borne. There is also a more subtle coping mechanism at work: spatial sequencing. Medieval people often tried to put some distance, however modest, between eating, sleeping, praying, and relieving themselves. That distance could be physical or symbolic. A yard privy at least separated the act from the main room. A castle garderobe allowed the chamber to remain nominally distinct from the discharge point. A monastic latrine block separated bodily necessity from the refectory and choir. These arrangements were never perfect, but they mattered because they helped preserve categories. Human life became easier to organize when its activities could be sorted into spaces, even if the spaces were linked by smell, labor, and drainage underneath. The persistence of such efforts reminds us again that medieval people were not resigned to disorder in any simple sense. They invested thought in arrangement. They cared about airflow, convenience, access, and relative cleanliness. They noticed which placements were worse. They valued buildings or institutions that handled waste somewhat better. They remembered bad examples. In that respect, the medieval toilet becomes a lesson in constrained rationality. People worked intelligently within narrow margins. They did not possess the tools for comprehensive sanitation, but they often recognized practical improvements when they saw them. The common image of medieval indifference collapses once we pay attention to how much daily effort went into making bad systems slightly less bad. At the same time, coping strategies could deepen inequality. A wealthy home could buy more cloth, more labor, better containers, and somewhat better spatial separation. A poorer one may do with reuse, improvisation, and tighter proximity. A monastery with good water access could achieve a cleaner rhythm than an urban tenement court. A castle could isolate its lord's comfort better than a peasant cottage could. Thus, the experience of disgust was shaped not only by climate and technology but by one's place in the social order. The toilet equalized everyone at the level of bodily necessity, but it did not equalize the quality of the solution. Some people could keep the worst consequences at greater distance than others. That distance mattered psychologically as well as physically. To have a servant empty the pot, to have a private route to a garderobe, to have linen changed more often, to have fewer people sharing a room, to have access to better water or a cleaner yard, these were not small differences. They changed how much of one's day was taken up by bodily maintenance and how much humiliation was attached to it. Modern viewers often think of luxury in terms of decoration or food. Medieval sanitation suggests another measure of luxury: the ability to keep waste farther from the self, or at least to make someone else responsible for its movement. The inverse was true for the poor and for the transient. Renters in subdivided urban houses, laborers in cramped lodgings, travelers in crowded inns, servants sleeping near kitchens or workspaces, and villagers with limited yard arrangements all lived nearer to waste in every sense. Their days required more stepping around, more sharing, more waiting, more carrying, and more tolerance for other people's negligence. The history of toilets is therefore also a history of time lost to discomfort. Every difficult trip to the privy, every vessel to be emptied, every child to be cleaned, every cloth to be washed, every bad smell to be aired out took minutes and effort from people who had little to spare. And still, out of all this, medieval communities built customs of decency. There were expectations about where one should not dump waste, how a host should prepare a room, how a religious house should be maintained, how a respectable household should appear, how a market street should be cleared, and how a person should not shame neighbors through obvious sanitary neglect. Those customs matter because they show that disgust was socialized into standards, however limited. A town or home did not need to be clean in modern terms to be judged more or less decent by contemporary ones. The medieval toilet was disgusting, but it was also part of a moral landscape in which order, consideration, and competence were still valued. That moral landscape could become sharper during feast days, visits, legal inspections, or religious occasions. Public order was most visible when outsiders were present or when the household represented itself more formally. Extra sweeping, airing, and clearing likely took place before important moments, just as they do in many societies. This suggests that sanitation had ceremonial edges. People made special efforts when status, reputation, or devotion were on display. Yet such efforts also reveal how temporary order could be. A court or street might be improved for the occasion, while the deeper system remained unchanged. The toilet, once more, reminds us that polished surfaces often rest upon unresolved material burdens. There is a final twist to all of this coping. The very routines developed to manage filth could render it less visible and therefore easier to underestimate. If pots were emptied early, if privies were visited at predictable times, if bad corners were avoided, and if unpleasant labor happened at dawn or after dark, then the sanitary burden could fade into the background of memory. This may be one reason later generations sometimes romanticized the medieval home. Good routine concealed just enough to let architecture and ceremony dominate the surviving imagination. But the concealment was never complete. Behind every well-run hall, cloister, cottage, or townhouse was the same unending requirement to handle what every body produced. And once we see that, another question naturally rises. If medieval people worked so hard to impose order, if they understood foulness as a threat to comfort and sometimes to health, and if they developed customs to distinguish the decent from the disgraceful, then why did the underlying systems remain so persistently inadequate? The answer leads beyond the household and into the deeper limits of medieval infrastructure itself, into water supply, urban planning, inherited Roman precedents, local fragmentation, building materials, and the stubborn fact that a civilization can be sophisticated in law, faith, war, and art while still lacking the coordinated technical framework needed to keep human waste reliably out of daily life. And that is perhaps the most important thing to carry away from this subject. Medieval toilets were disgusting, certainly, but not because medieval people were somehow too foolish to care. They were disgusting because sanitation is one of the hardest achievements of settled life. It asks for water, planning, labor, maintenance, cooperation, and time, every day without interruption. Medieval Europe could produce remarkable churches, disciplined monasteries, formidable castles, intricate laws, and lively towns. But in the quiet, unglamorous business of moving waste safely away from the body, it often fell short. And in that shortfall, we see something deeply human. Civilizations are not measured only by what they build in stone or write in books. They are also measured by how they manage the ordinary burdens no one can escape. What makes the medieval toilet such a revealing topic is that it strips away romance without stripping away sympathy. It reminds us that the past was lived through bodies before it was remembered through monuments. A noble in a private chamber, a monk in a communal latrine, a merchant in a crowded town house, a servant carrying out a chamber pot before dawn, a mother managing children and washing with too little water, a laborer stepping carefully through a muddy yard in winter. They all inhabited the same broad reality. Waste stayed close. Privacy was fragile. Cleanliness took effort. Smell carried social meaning. And every small improvement depended on someone's work. It also shows us how much of history is hidden in maintenance. We tend to remember crowns, battles, cathedrals, and kings, But daily life was held together by quieter acts. The drain cleared before it overflowed, the pit emptied before it failed, the bedding aired after sickness, the room swept before a guest arrived, the vessel carried out before the day properly began. Those acts rarely become legends, yet without them no household, castle, monastery, or town could have functioned at all. In that sense, the medieval toilet is not a trivial subject. It is a doorway into labor, class, health, architecture, weather, and the emotional texture of ordinary life. And perhaps that is why the story lingers. It is easy to laugh at the discomfort of another age from the safety of modern plumbing. It is harder and more worthwhile to recognize the vulnerability underneath it. Medieval people did not stand outside their own world any more than we stand outside ours. They worked within constraints they had inherited, improved what they could, endured what they could not, and built entire societies while living closer to dirt and waste than most of us would find bearable for even a day. Their toilets were disgusting, yes, but the deeper story is not really about disgust. It is about how much human life depends on systems so basic that we only notice them when they fail. So the next time the Middle Ages are presented only as castles, armor, candlelight, and grand stone halls, it may be worth remembering the colder, sharper truth just beneath that image. Behind every bannered chamber was a garderobe. Behind every crowded street was a drain or a ditch struggling to cope. Behind every respectable household was a routine of carrying, cleaning, airing, and enduring. And behind all of it was the same simple fact that has followed every society in history. No matter how high its walls or how splendid its rituals, every human world must still reckon with the body. If you've made it this far, thank you for spending this quiet stretch of history with me. And if you enjoy thoughtful, long-form documentaries like this, do consider subscribing. A like on the video is always a simple way to support the channel as well. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments, where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and which part of the story surprised you most. And if there's another history topic you'd like to drift into on a future evening, let me know there too. Until next time, thank you for listening.